I have been doing archaeology for a good 25 years, the last 10 years or so here in Illinois. As she said too, I analyze fauna remains, zooarchaeological materials, so all the bone and shell and fish scale and things that we find at archaeological sites. That can tell us a lot about diet and the environment, also how people used animal remains, not only for food, but also the remains for making tools and ritual items and things like that. Now, my novel, Sunken Dreams, there we go. The idea came to me to start this book many years ago when I was working on a survey project in Wisconsin. Now, most archaeological surveys, when you're out actually looking for archaeological sites, aren't all that exciting. It's not like the movies. There's not a lot of car chases, no gold, no whips, nothing like that. Okay, it's just you basically walk fields and you trudge through forests and swamps and you dig a lot of holes in the ground looking for artifacts. Basically, we're out there trying to find archaeological materials that can tell us, hey, there's a site here and it's going to be impacted, or this site is important because it's going to tell us something about a specific period in time or a specific group of people. But while you're doing the actual survey, there's one word that describes it: boring. Okay? It can be very boring to be walking cornfields day after day after day and not finding anything. Because more often than not, you don't find artifacts. But on the plus side, it gives you a lot of time to think. And while we were doing this project in East Central Wisconsin, I came across a note about another archaeologist who had surveyed in the area years before. And this person had actually drowned in a boating accident while they were out on Lake Winnebago, which is a pretty good sized lake if any of you are familiar with Wisconsin. And, you know, being an oddball archaeologist, like archaeologists tend to be, it got me kind of thinking, well, okay, that's really tragic that he drowned. But it kind of made me think, well, maybe it wasn't a drowning. What if it wasn't a drowning? You know, why would anyone kill an archaeologist? I mean, we're great. Nobody wants to kill archaeologists. But it started to make me think that, you know, this might be a good idea for a mystery. Because that's what archaeology is in a lot of ways. It's a mystery. We take pieces of the past and try and put them together to reconstruct a picture of what life was like, you know, 1,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago. And it's really difficult to do. Now, while you're out doing these surveys, like the one I described, a lot of times you stay in hotels. When I was on the road doing field work, it was basically any time between March and November I would be in a hotel room away from home. And that can get pretty boring. You know, you watch TV, you eat out at diners, not a lot to do in some of these small towns. But it gives you a lot of time to think and a lot of time to write. And that's when I started fleshing out the story behind Sunken Dreams, writing up different scenes and kind of working in a protagonist who's an archaeologist but also has an interest in solving a mystery. In this case, the mystery of this other archaeologist who had died years earlier under mysterious circumstances. Now, some of you might be thinking, well, okay, you know, we don't know this guy from Adam. What does he know about archaeology and mysteries? Well, there's a lot of carryover between archaeology and mysteries. And one of the classics is Agatha Christie, who, you know, hopefully most of you are familiar with. She is one of the most prolific mystery writers of the 20th century. And she wrote hundreds of books and plays and all kinds of things. That's her up in the center there. She also wrote a number of her mysteries involving archaeology. For example, the Murder in Mesopotamia, which is on the bottom. You can see all the classic archaeology paraphernalia. There are some pots and bottles and some artwork, and of course the pith helmet. You don't see that a lot anymore in archaeology for some reason. It's not with it. Not as cool as they used to be, I guess. But Agatha Christie was also married to an archaeologist named Sir Max Mallowan, and she accompanied him on a number of his digs and wrote a book about it, Come Tell Me How You Live, about their different adventures digging on sites in the Middle East. So I have a little bit of support through Mrs. Christie here. But there's also a number of other things that can kind of show you how archaeology and mysteries go together. I'm just going to run through a few of them. I'm not going to talk too long because I'd rather hear from you guys and answer any questions you might have. First and foremost, we have sifting for clues. Obviously, in archaeology, we screen lots and lots of dirt trying to find artifacts. And then artifacts that we're going to put back together later on, you know, to get that picture of the past that I talked about. So we see a little bit, see a lot of that in archaeology, but also in mystery fiction as well, where the detective will sift through the clues to try and figure out the identity of the culprit. Who's behind the crime that's involved? They look at footprints and they make patterns of different artifacts and things like that and try and identify what these clues mean in terms of telling us about the individuals responsible. Archaeology, in a lot of ways, is an unsolved mystery. It's basically a cold case. It's not always a crime, necessarily, but it's something that we don't know the whole picture of, and we're trying to learn about it. Okay? The people who committed the quote-unquote crime in the past, or who left the artifacts behind, left the sites behind, they're dead, and we can't ask them exactly what happened. So again, that's a lot like a cold case crime, in which people have passed away, memories have changed, information is lost. So clues are few and infrequent, and it's difficult always to solve a cold case crime in either fiction or in archaeology. One important aspect and trait that all archaeologists should have is the ability to make good observations. Obviously, we're looking at artifacts that were left behind. Basically, we're looking at dead people's garbage, trying to reconstruct their lives, okay? If you went home and dug through your garbage, would somebody else be able to figure out exactly what your life was like? Probably not. It's difficult to do, and it gets worse over time. So archaeologists have to be very careful about the observations they make, and then they have to infer information from these artifacts and from the sites we look at in order to figure out the story that's being told. And that's classic in mysteries as well. Obviously, some of the classics using deductive logic to figure things out. Sherlock Holmes, even Hercule Poirot using his little gray cells to solve crimes. Not quite as impressive, but Inspector Clouseau as well. They all use observation to figure out clues and to get the answers they're seeking. And that's what archaeologists do as well. Now, it's not all observation and guesswork, though. There's a lot of science involved in archaeology, just like there is in mysteries. Nowadays, archaeologists rely as heavily on observation, but also heavily on scientific techniques to fill in the blanks. Some of my colleagues, for example, are looking at isotopes from bones to figure out where people and animals lived and what their diets were like. And that's something that wasn't being done 30 or 40 years ago. Same thing in mystery fiction nowadays. You hear about the CSI shows, crime scene analysis, forensics. Very important for solving crimes. Almost too easy in some ways. You'll watch on TV, a technician will find a hair or a straw, and they put it in a machine, and within instance, they have a DNA profile of the criminal, where they lived, how they can be found, and how you can trick them into revealing that they are actually the culprit. It's a little too easy sometimes, and I don't think it's quite that simple. I'm not a forensic anthropologist, but I'm pretty sure it's a little more complicated than that. There we go. Also, that's why in mysteries, very often we have the red herring. The concept of the red herring is basically a false clue that tricks the reader or the detective trying to solve the crime by giving them information that maybe leads them in a different direction. And we don't have that specifically in archaeology. It's not likely that prehistoric Native Americans intentionally buried things in a certain way to trick us 1,000 years later. Okay, they had better things to do than worry about what goofy archaeologists are going to think about. But artifacts by themselves don't tell us everything. Okay? They're a clue, but we have to look at them and interpret them correctly. There's easy to make mistakes because artifacts can be interpreted in different ways. So for example, one good example of, well, it's not a great example, of a red herring, take a look at this feature here. And you can see all the artifacts in here and where the flags have marked the edge of the feature and how one half of it has been taken out. Okay? Get some artifacts, archaeological tools here, a little map, placard for taking photographs. Okay, you think you could get a fair amount of information about that, right? Well, this is actually a fake privy pit that we created for an archaeology event open to the public so they could see what archaeology is like, what the fieldwork is like. Now, obviously, any information we get out of this isn't going to tell you anything. Okay, it's just kind of a cautionary note that when looking at artifacts, they can tell different stories. And you have to be careful and specific in what you're looking for. The secret doors and hidden passages, that's more of a mystery fiction thing. There's always this secret panel where the villain, is able to access different parts of the house, for example, to commit his crimes and then escape. You really don't see that in archaeology, at least not in Illinois. The image of Howard Carter opening up Tut's tomb back in the 1920s is probably about as close as we're going to get. So that's not a great example of the connection between archaeology and mysteries, but I thought it was worth a quick mention. The smoking gun is probably the most characteristic thing of mysteries and mystery fiction, where basically the criminal's caught in the act, literally with the gun smoking in his hand, as you can see in this old illustration here. There's a gentleman kind of slumped over the table. I'm pretty sure he's not sleeping. Another one standing here with a smoking gun, and then someone bursts in, and, well, seems pretty self-explanatory that it must have been this guy here, right? Maybe not. That's the whole difference with mystery fiction and reality. In archaeology, we rarely see a smoking gun. We don't always have the precision we need to find that exact moment in time. Okay, we're talking 1,000 years ago. To try and get an exact event is very difficult. I do have one good example, and this is from a site in the American Bottom, the East St. Louis site, and it also involves faunal remains, so I think it's great. What we have here, this is a deer thoracic vertebra. Okay, the spinal cord would go right here, and this is the base or centrum area of the vertebra. And right here is an arrowhead that actually punctured the bone through the neural arch and hit the spinal column and killed the deer. So right here we have an example of the actual event where a deer was hunted and killed by a Native American hunter 1,000 years ago. And then the animal's taken back, the meat was removed, the hide was probably taken. So this is about as close as we get to finding that specific smoking gun of an event. If we look into it further, we can talk about different kinds of hunting practices and things like that. You'll notice it's a little hard because there's not a picture of a deer up here with it, but this deer is actually shot from below. Okay? There's 4 or 5 other examples in Illinois where we have arrowheads stuck into bone, and almost all the rest of them, the arrow was shot from above into the bone, suggesting they were hunting from trees or maybe at higher elevations. With this deer, either they were laying down when they shot the bow and arrow, which I don't think you can do, or they were shooting an animal up high on a hill perhaps. So it gives a little bit more information about maybe how they were hunting. And then the amateur detective idea, that kind of relates a little bit more to my book, Sunken Dreams, because as was said, the protagonist is an archaeologist first and a detective second. Jacob Kuehn is out leading a field school when he runs across this information about a professor who died years earlier. He's worried about getting his field school done, but he's really intrigued with solving this mystery of what really did happen to Professor Wardell, who died earlier. And you see that a lot in mystery fiction. Generally, it's the little old lady who bakes cookies, and she runs a bed and breakfast, and it's got to be in Maine, of course. And she also solves gruesome murders that seem to happen almost every day in these small towns in Maine, which kind of makes you wonder why anyone would go to these places, because in every book, 2 or 3 people are killed. You know, the classic Jessica Fletcher or Nancy Drew kind of thing. I'm not picking on amateur detectives. I think it's a really interesting genre in fiction. As far as archaeology goes, professional archaeologists can learn a lot from local collectors and avocational archaeologists. These are the people who know the archaeology, they know the sites in the local area, and they can tell us a lot. So it's really important for us to get a good rapport with these collectors, find out where they collected, what sites they know about, what sites might be in danger of getting impacted by development or looting, things like that. I actually included an avocational archaeology group in my novel just because I really have found those folks are great to work with and have a lot of information. And it's a rapport that we really need to cultivate. And finally, we have the big reveal, naming the killer. In mystery fiction, it's always the detective, whether he's an amateur or a police detective, will draw everyone together in the drawing room. Okay? As far as I can tell, a drawing room has no other purpose other than to be used for the explanation of crime. Okay? I don't know why. We don't have a drawing room in my house, so I can only assume that's the only reason. But everyone is drawn together, and then the detective will go from each person and explain why they could or could not have done it, and then dramatically reveals the true killer, and everyone's shocked and they're arrested and they confess their crimes and every other sin they've ever had. Archaeology, we don't get to do that. The people who created our sites are long gone. Their descendants are still around, so we have to provide the information to them. But most archaeologists simply do an archaeological site report or maybe a journal article, or we give a talk at a professional conference or maybe a talk to the public, telling people about what we found. So we don't get the drama that you see with naming a killer, but it's still important to get our information out there. For archaeologists, for all the students who want to go into archaeology, you might follow it as a career. The most important thing you can ever do with an archaeological site, archaeological materials, is you have to report it. You have to get the information out to the public. Okay? You can excavate 1,000 sites, dig up 20,000 artifacts, clean them, wash them, analyze them, write up your little technical report, inventories, everything. If the public doesn't know about it, the professional community and the general public who's interested, if they don't know about it, it's the same as if the site was still in the ground or covered by a parking lot or bulldozed and shoved into a ditch. Okay? Artifacts. And in archaeology, artifacts are not the important thing. It's what the artifacts tell us about people, people's behavior thousands of years ago. Okay? In my book, I tried not to be... In writing Sunken Dreams, there was a concern about making it too much of an archaeology textbook or too much of a mystery. Okay? It had to be a nice balance because I didn't want the mystery people to be bored by all the technical talk, and I didn't want all the mystery stuff to take away from the little lessons that you try to work in. But I did stress a few things, and one of them was that it isn't about the artifacts, it's about the people who made them and left them behind. Now in Sunken Dreams, Jacob Kuehn is an archaeology professor, and he's taking his field school out to the Wacona site, a prehistoric Native American village, where Professor Jacqueline Wardell had died years earlier. She had drowned in a boating accident. First thing off, he's mainly worried about getting his field school done, getting his career on track, worrying about tenure, all the kind of things that professional archaeologists tend to worry about. But then some odd things start happening around the camp. There's some trespassers, which you see, people are curious. And then there's a break-in at the lab, out there at their field lab. And then there's a murder in an otherwise pretty quiet little town in northern Wisconsin. And Professor Kuehn starts to wonder if the two cases might be connected. He's been reading Jacqueline Wardell's field journal, the one she wrote the season she died, and is starting to see some parallels between her field school and his. And pretty soon it's up to him to decide what to do about it. Is he going to try and solve this crime, if it is indeed a crime, no matter what the cost? If you're interested, I invite you to read the book. I hope you would enjoy it. At this point, if anyone has any questions, I'd rather give you guys a chance to ask me anything that's of interest. Archaeology, mysteries, whatever. Yes?
If your work takes you to a certain place and you uncover something and the place is inhabited, who would get a particular item that you would have uncovered? Would it be like the people who inhabited there, or like you?
Okay, like the modern landowner?
Right.
Nowadays, when we go out and do a survey, generally, basically you get a piece of paper that for the landowner. If the landowner wants to donate anything that is found, they can sign off and give it away. Because a lot of times the artifacts are like bits of broken stone or pottery and things like that that don't have a lot of meaning or monetary value. If we go out and excavate a large site, generally we try and get the landowners to donate what they have, but it's really up to the landowners. So if you go out and find, let's say, an old privy pit with old bottles on it on your property, I mean, they're still yours. They belong to the landowner. Yes?
What's the most exciting thing you've ever found?
The most exciting thing I ever found, it's really kind of sad because it was like 25 years ago and it was still the most exciting thing. We were excavating an Oneota village. It's a late prehistoric village up near La Crosse in Wisconsin. And in one of the features, there's a piece of copper about this big in the shape of a feather. It was actually cut, and they had some incised lines on it that made it look like a feather with a hole in it that probably served as a pendant or some sort of decoration. Most of what I look at are animal bones, which are really cool because you can find, all kinds of stuff: bison bones, wolf teeth, birds that aren't found around here anymore. But that feather was always really kind of impressed me. Yes?
Do you focus on mainly in North America, or have you ever gone around the world and done other sites like that?
I've only ever worked in North America. A lot in the Midwest. I was up in Alaska, north of the Arctic Circle, for a couple of weeks, excavating a caribou kill site. A little bit out west, but mainly in the Midwest. When I was in field school in that, as an undergraduate, they asked if I wanted to go work at Kubi Fora, one of the early hominid sites over in Africa, and it was very tempting, but also incredibly expensive. So I decided to stay close to home. But there's some neat sites all over the place. It's amazing what you can find right in the Midwest. Yes, sir?
How long did it take you to write your book?
Ooh, this is embarrassing. I probably first started it maybe 10 or 12 years ago when I first got the idea and started writing it. But I did it in kind of spurts. You'd write for a while, then you'd edit and revise and think, oh my God, this is terrible, and you throw it all out and start all over again. But it was probably a couple of years worth of time, all said and done. And then the problem is with writing, that I found out, is once you write something, the first thing you have to do is edit it, and then you revise it, and then you have other people look at it, and they say, oh, that's terrible, and you said this wrong, and this is wrong, and you got to rewrite it, and it's like writing an archaeology site report. Everybody else gets to comment on it, and then you have to rewrite it and make it all correct. So once you even get that done, then you have to find somebody who's willing to publish the book, which is another. That wasn't quite as bad, but it was also very daunting to have a lot of literary agents say, I'm not interested in your book, and off it goes to the next guy. So it takes time, especially when you're working full-time and all that too. But it's also a lot of fun to kind of create your own world. It's like, I can have anything happen in this. I can go down the street and get yelled at, but in my book, everything's great. Yes?
Do you or your associates make use of programs like GIS in your work? Definitely.
The GIS, all kinds of technological innovations are very big in archaeology now. When I started, we were still using the old-fashioned transits, straight out of World War II for mapping sites and that. We didn't have high-tech computer systems and that, but GIS, ground-penetrating radar, all kinds of scientific stuff. That's really where the future of archaeology is if you can take that information and use it more efficiently, that's great. I'm kind of a bread and butter archaeologist. I look at the bones, I use the computer to write it up, but a lot of my colleagues are a lot more scientific, a lot more technical, and they're able to do a lot more. So that's, if you're in archaeology, definitely follow GIS stuff, get a certificate if you can. A lot of students that I know are looking into that. Yes?
Is there a specific thing you're trying to research in some of the work that you're doing? Or are you just looking for whatever?
With the archaeology that I do, I mean, it's all faunal remains, mostly. We look at a lot of the basics, diet, environment, how they use bones and shells for tools. But recently I started working on a project looking at domestic dog remains from East St. Louis and a couple of these other sites. Basically trying to figure out what was the role of the dog in the Native American community. Because generally think, okay, dogs were around to help with hunting, or they guarded camps, or they ate garbage, or whatever. We're finding out that the role of dogs actually changed over time. During the late woodland period, dogs had a variety of uses. They were beasts of burden. Actually, they were pulling carts or had saddlebags on them. And I'll tell you why in a second, how we know that in a second. But they were also using dogs in rituals for sacrifice. We found one dog at Fish Lake, the Fish Lake site. There's one dog buried in like a central courtyard in front of a group of houses. And he was buried near where we found some passenger pigeon wing bones that were used for fans. So there's obviously some sort of ritual going on there. The dog was buried all by himself with a clay pot and some tobacco and a little bit of red ochre. Okay, right in the middle of like in your front yard, basically. At the same site, a little bit farther away, we have a set of houses and a courtyard, and then behind the house, we found another pit with dog remains in it, and all these dog bones have cut marks all over. And this is representing a feasting event. Okay, so obviously dogs were playing different roles in society. A couple hundred years later, we get into the terminal late woodland, and over half the dogs, we have 135 individual dogs at a couple of these sites in the American Bottom, all dating to this terminal late woodland period. Over half of them have what we call spinous process anomalies. I'm going to go back real quick. Okay, this thoracic, dang it. Okay, this thoracic vertebra, this part sticking up is called the neural spine. Okay, all vertebrae, the thoracics and lumbar have this. In half of the dogs, the spine, instead of being straight, is bent over on a bunch of the vertebra. And that's repetitive stress injury from them carrying heavy loads. Okay, so suddenly in the terminal late woodland, dogs become little horses for the Native Americans, and they're carrying something. We don't know what it was. I suspect it was like firewood and foodstuffs. But then by the time you get into the Mississippian period, you don't see that anymore. So you can see the primary role of dogs was changing over time. But dogs were important enough in the community that they were giving them burials when they died. Okay, instead of being put with the other food material in the middens, these dogs were getting specific burials. They were obviously a special, important, significant part of the community. So you can find out a lot when you do some of the archaeology work, focusing on the bones. That's about the most important. What I'm working on now, we're doing stuff with caribou and bison kills and all that. But the dog stuff is really interesting because it's filling in a gap that we didn't know before. Anyone else? Yes?
What made you want to be an archaeologist? Like, did you grow up watching Scooby-Doo or Indiana Jones? Or
No, Indiana Jones was a little after my youth, but when I was a kid, I was always into fossils and paleontology, so I really wanted to get into dinosaurs and all that kind of stuff. And I was always interested in history in the past, so I kind of merged those together, and I liked the outdoors, the wildlife, and that kind of stuff. So it kind of all fit together. And when I was in high school, and there was the local museum had offered a dinosaur dig. You'd pay like $600, and they'd take you out west, and you'd dig up dinosaurs. So I was all excited, I had all the paperwork filled out. Then they told me, well, you're not old enough, and you can't go unless you find someone else who'll go with you. And it's like, well, I'm not my parent. I don't really want my parents dragging me out west. That'll be a blast. But that really bummed me out, so I got more into the archaeology instead of the paleontology. It's like, so if this is probably more for the professors in the room, but when students ask for volunteer opportunities and that, it's like help them out because it's going to mean a lot. I mean, I would have loved to have gone and done that. Otherwise, I'd be here talking about dinosaurs probably. But I always like the past, learning about the past and solving those puzzles. You know, it's just kind of a challenge. Plus, you can never have a wrong answer because it's all interpretation. So, anyone else? Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
Can you talk about the nature of your job and what kind of opportunities are out there for students like us studying biology or studying anthropology that help us get involved, or at least get a little taste about what is out there?
Okay. When you're first, you want to focus more on when you, as a student or once you've graduated? Oh, okay. Job opportunity. Okay, that's fine. A lot of places will allow volunteers to come in and help out if they have some experience. If you're interested in like faunal remains, for example, you know, you can volunteer at the lab and we will try and set something up. Okay, if we can. It's not always feasible for like a huge project, but we've had some smaller projects set up for students to work on for like their senior thesis papers or master's thesis papers, things like that. In archaeology, you know, there's people who specialize in lithics, bone, ethnobotanical or floral remains, so there's things like that. In a lot of ways, you really just need to kind of inquire as what's available. A lot of times, actually I met my wife through this, where some archaeology organizations will have volunteer nights as well. I'm not familiar with too many in this area, but then again, nobody's really asked about setting them up either. But you can get in just the basics of washing artifacts and things like that, learning how it's done, participating in volunteer digs and surveys can always work. As far as the career itself, to do archaeology professionally, you need to have a field school. So you know how to do the field aspects of archaeology. But other than that, any background information or experience or skills you have can be applied to archaeology. I mean, photography skills, the GIS stuff, anything like that is usually very helpful. I don't know if I'm really answering your question properly.
Can I interject?
Yes.
One thing that I just wanted to bring up is if you're interested in working in archaeology, you need to go where the jobs are.
Yeah.
So that doesn't mean, oh, I grew up in Champaign, I don't want to leave, and then you never end up going into archaeology because you never leave to gain any experience. Doesn't mean you can't move back at some point, but so we traveled quite a bit when we first met.
Yeah, my first job was in Minneapolis, and when I was there, the first thing they did is sent me to Michigan. So I'll figure that out. So I did field work there. Then we were in Iowa, Colorado, Wyoming, the Dakotas, back in Wisconsin.
And who did you work with then? Who did you work for, I should
Okay,
ask?
a lot of the times I worked for cultural resource management firms, CRM firms. Okay, they're basically the folks, that's like ISAS. Basically, they go out and do federally and state mandated archaeological surveys. Okay, anytime federal or state money is involved, well, not so much state, but when there's federal money involved on any kind of highway project or development project, they have to have an environmental impact survey done. Okay, and part of that environmental impact is to deal with cultural resources, archaeological materials. Same as like if they're going to knock down a historic house, they need to have somebody go out and look for those things first. Okay, so there's a lot of that, and that's where most of the jobs are, is with CRM related firms.
And a lot of times the jobs will be like 8 weeks long.
Yeah,
Or
some will be
6 months,
temporary,
or-
some will be longer.
Yeah.
Generally, if you can get in with a good firm and show that you have something to offer, they will keep you around. I mean, a lot of the people who come and work at ISAS doing field work, once winter rolls around and the field work kind of dries up because it's too cold and the ground's frozen, they'll keep on in the lab, washing artifacts, learning analysis techniques, even just doing data entry and photographs and stuff. It's just a good way to get started. And then it helps the students kind of learn what they want to specialize in. I mean, my first job, I had taken some zooarchaeology classes, okay, and then I got my first job, And they had a bunch of bison bones laying out, and they were trying to figure out what they were. And like, so, you know, I walk over and say, well, this is this, this is this, this is this. And, you know, by the end of the week, that's all I was doing was analyzing faunal remains for them. So, and certain fields or certain areas of archaeology are more, there's more need for them than others. Like, there's not a lot of people doing faunal analysis around. A couple of them have retired. I'm here, and there's a few other in the Midwest, but you know, I think it's a great field. But if you're into lithics or whatever, you can learn more about it, you know, working for these CRM firms or volunteering or trying to find lab work. It's usually a little harder to find lab work than it is field work, just because there's fewer jobs.